Okay, so in regards to the long jumper, it literally, if you did well on question 2, then I'll just move the camera closer just so it's easier for you guys to see. It's the same thing, the same concept. If you can talk about antagonistic muscle pairs and where they occur, you're winning at life. So the first thing that you did is ignore the words written for you. You didn't talk about the elbow and the hip, which again is a bit crazy when we think about it, but the pressure of an exam sometimes brings out the worst of us, not the best of us. So remember, they pay money to use these images, okay? They have to source it, they have to pay to use these images. So there's a reason why they spend money on that image, okay? So examine the antagonistic muscle action taking place at the elbow and the hip in figure 2 that allows the long jumper to achieve this position. So when we're looking at the elbow's there, and we're looking at the hip there. So we know that extension, because the arm's straight, it's not bent, is happening at both elbows. So the reason why they've used this exact picture is one arm's not doing one thing, one's doing the other. They're both doing the same thing at the same time. So with the elbow, we've got extension. So just literally putting extension at the elbow gets you your first initial mark. And then because it's asked us to talk about antagonistic muscle pairs, we must talk about what the two muscles are doing to provide that movement. So first mark extension at the elbow, and then we say, because we're good at connectives and we're good at expanding because it's an examen question, so we're asked to explain what's going on, because the triceps have contracted, which causes extension at the elbow, which we talked about in the last question. That gives us the second mark. So we said extension and what's caused extension, because that is contracted. And because it's asked about the antagonistic, so it's a pair, in order to contract and pull our arm out when we're jumping, we must allow our bicep actually starts that action. It starts relaxing, which enables our tricep to contract. So we couldn't do it if our bicep stayed contracted. Our bicep has to relax to enable us to contract our triceps. So you literally reverse what we've just said. The biceps need to relax to enable this to happen. It's so simple, and it's always the same thing when we talk about antagonistic pairs. They're working in partnership. One allows one to do one thing, one again allows the other thing to do the other thing. So a bicep will by default relax to allow my arm to extend outwards, and my tricep will relax to allow my bicep to contract and pull it inwards. So we're always talking about both muscles in that action. The hip, I think some of us forgot what the muscles that operate. I think we had a lot of hamstrings and a lot of quadriceps, which of course you already know, and I've just clearly forgotten that they only operate your knee. So your hamstrings and your quadriceps only operate your knee. So your hip flexors operate your hips, and your gluteals, so your bum and the ones on the inside, your hip flexors and your gluteals, operate your hip. And that makes sense when you look at a picture of it, because that's literally the closest part to your hip. So you get flexion at the hip. As you can see, the angle where they should normally stand like this, we've reduced the angle, and flexion is reduction of angle, and extension is increasing the angle. Okay, so we reduce an angle and we increase the angle. That's literally the definition of flexion and extension. It's helpful for future knowledge. So flexion at the hip, the same as before. We've said what it is and where. So we flex the hip because the hip flexors contract. So they're on the inside, and the gluteus maximus, or you could put the gluteals, relax to enable this to happen. If you're not sure, just this first sentence here, what is happening, the fact that identifying the hip flexors and the gluteals or the gluteus maximus work together can pull a second mark in. If you can't quite tell me which way round they work, at least you've pulled in 2 out of the 3 marks on here, and hopefully you've nailed that one. So out of 6 marks, you could have ended up with 5, rather than a lot of us ended up with 0 or 1 on this question. Again, it wasn't a complex question. It wasn't to trip people up. The early questions are pretty straightforward. These are nice questions. Okay, they could have said the knee and it would have been even easier. That's the only way that question could have been any easier at all. And you would have looked at the knee and talked about the hamstring and the quadriceps and which one caused the flexion that's occurring, the extension, that's occurring at the knee. So I would expect drawings like this on your paper. So would an examiner. And I can see how your process of working, and even if you've even got this description down the side and you've not written here, I could still access that information as a marker, because that's clearly identifying that flexion is decreasing the angle of a joint and extension increasing. I'd like you to apply it to the question, but there's some bits of information that are quite helpful there. So question 3, as I said, this worst part we aren't able to write simply enough here. Some of us waffled quite a lot on this question. And it was it's simpler than you thought, perhaps.